2008, and the topic was intimate partner violence within a Chinese community in San Francisco, problem gambling as a risk factor. And what they did here is they took a total of 31 people. So here we go with our small numbers again. They were recruited from 3 social service agencies that help people who are struggling. So some of them have many social problems. And they did a survey. So they did a survey on these people, and they did a survey asking for certain things, demographic criteria, and then they wanted to, after the demographics, they were looking at whether anybody had experienced intimate partner violence, and also substances. And what they found, right, is participants whose partners were problem gamblers were 27.5 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence. And it was significant to note that this was also when, in this study, they used one of the rating scales that you can use to assess the extent of problematic gambling, which is the South Oaks gambling screen, and they found that the more severe, so the more severe the gambling problem, so people who scored above 10, the total is 20, is where you most likely could start to see the violence occur. And then the other one was a study that was done. It used data from Australia and Hong Kong, but in this particular article, it was only the Australian data that was that had been analyzed. And they looked at the problem gambling and family violence. Family member reports of prevalence, family impacts, and coping. And what they found is that over half of the family members of problem gamblers reported some form of family violence in the past 12 months. And they also saw this bidirectional violence was the most common form of violence in the sample. That's interesting. So it's sometimes the gambler who was the perpetrator of violence, but it was also sometimes the family who was so the gambler was the victim. So family was violent towards the gambler. So there's also that concept. But interestingly, what they saw was that 21.6% of participants who reported victimization. So 21.6% of patients reported both victimization and perpetration of family violence. However, what I actually wanted to say was the next point, which is that interestingly, people who self-reported their gambling problem, so people who came in and reported themselves to have problem gambling, were actually the ones who were likely to be perpetrators of violence and not necessarily victims. So what that means is if the gambler is most likely to be the perpetrator of violence rather than the victim, it raises questions around then what happens in families where more than one member has a gambling problem. So there'd be a lot of violence in that family, I think. And I think this is basically my trying to tie these things up together and conclude, which is that the intimate relationships and family environments of problem gamblers are often characterized by relationship dissatisfaction. There's a lot of conflict, there's reduced stability, there's reduced trust, poor communication, there's financial deprivation and confusion of family roles and responsibilities. And I think that Nokolo and Alpheus touched on these points very well and explained them further. So the intimate partners and children of problem gamblers experience reduced emotional and physical health and high rates of maladaptive behaviors. And I think this just goes to say that it's not just only just physical violence in a sense. It's not physical distress only that the problematic gambling has on the partner and the family. There's also a lot of emotional, psychological damage that occurs, and I think this one was also touched on previously, that the most common hypothesis relating to family violence perpetration is the stress resulting from problem gambling is a catalyst for the perpetration of violence by the problem gambler against the family. And I think in essence, rounding it up, although it seems like we really need to put in the effort to put to study this further, especially in our context. So we've got all of this data on international levels. It will be nice for us to know what's happening in our context, in our country, especially since we have so much violence going on. And I mean, our topic today is specifically gender-based violence. How much of that is influenced by problematic gambling? Because the literature as it is kind of indicating to us that problematic gambling can influence violent behavior. So how much of it is happening for us? And I think in the meantime, maybe there's also going to be benefit in establishing and investing better in more effective treatment programs for pathological gambling, because it will also kind of assist us in curbing some of those other risk factors that we picked up earlier, in particular intimate partner violence or gender-based violence. And I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Fane, for such a powerful presentation, a well-researched presentation. My name is Witness Arombe. I'm the financial manager at the SARGF. I will be presenting our next guest, who is Mr. Luvo Choko, also known as LT. Mr. Choko is a seasoned, well-respected senior manager from across the national and provincial spheres of government, and is not a stranger to public service, having imparted strategic management knowledge to young and old alike over his almost 15 years in senior management at various positions. Mr. Choko is currently the head of strategic management services for the Eastern Cape Gambling Board, managing the diverse portfolios of stakeholder management, marketing and communication, research and development, responsible gambling and public education, and corporate social responsibility. Previously, he also worked as a director in integrated planning and management, policy analysis and development for the Provincial Department of Health in the Eastern Cape. He was also a director of policy, development monitoring and evaluation for the Civilian Secretariat for Police in South Africa. He's also armed with a master's degree in media education and studies from the University of Natal, and he also has a series of developmental short courses with various institutions across the country, including WITS UCT and Fort Hare. Within his short period in the gambling industry and regulatory board of the Eastern Cape Gambling Board, Mr. Choko drives towards organizational performance and redefining the role and responsibility of regulatory board with the ECGB, which is the Eastern Cape Gambling Board. Its visibility and its board of knowledge increase, among others, is currently championing the importance of understanding, appreciating and implementing responsible gambling programs and mitigation of harmful effects of excessive and uncontrollable gambling by pandas and those who explore gambling as a recreational activity. has further enhanced the stakeholder relationship function within the provincial and national space of government, put to the ECGB within the reach and knowledge of a number of stakeholders, which this did not happen in the past. With the key competencies and skills he has in change and managing people, business management and strategy, Mr. Choko offers young and old minds with aspirations of going to either the private or public sector to see beyond their limitations and permissible challenges and use their
No, the video is gone. It's still here.
It's really gone.
Let's come back. Yes.
Okay, sorry, am I audible now? Someone can put a chat on our chat room if I'm audible now. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mplane, for presenting to us with such a well-researched presentation. I think we have learned a lot. At the moment, I'm going to present to you Mr. Luvo Choko, also known as LT, from the Eastern Cape Gambling Board. Mr. Choko is a seasoned and well-respected senior manager from across the national and provincial spheres of government. He is not a stranger to the public service, having imparted strategic management knowledge to young and old alike during his 15 years or more in various senior management positions. Mr. Choko is currently the head of strategic management services with the Eastern Cape Gambling Board. So he is going to take us through the next presentation in where he's trying to answer to what is the extent to which South African gambling legislation protects families from problem gambling. He's going to focus more on the gambling regulator perspective. I hand over to you, Mr. Choko.
Good afternoon, moderator. Good afternoon, or no, good day, colleagues. I'm not sure whether I'm audible enough. Can somebody just confirm that I'm audible enough? And somebody also can they confirm that they are going to load my presentation, or shall I just share the presentation on my own?
Mr. Choko, you may share it on your own.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, thank you very much. Is it visible now?
Yes, sir. You may proceed.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for those introductory remarks. I've got just few slides to speak to the audience, and I really appreciate the work that has been presented before me. It really is going to be responding or trying to respond to some of the issues that have been asked and that the leadership of the foundation has asked us to do. I bring warm greetings from the Eastern Cape province through this virtual platform. We really appreciate the opportunity to engage on this matter as the province. I'll speak to issues of the legislation in South Africa here, including the national and provincial pieces of legislation. When I was asked to prepare an input, I thought, let me just look at some of the international literature around gambling, especially the unintended consequences of family violence, harmful and excessive gambling. Then I'll just go through quickly on some inferences that has emerged around this subject matter. Before I make some recommendations for this exercise, I thought I will reflect on gambling as an invasive act because it becomes difficult to access, or rather to assess and determine whether really these social ills are a cause and are caused by harmful effects of excessive gambling. There are some recommendations that I'm putting forward, and the point is that it does appear that this seminar or webinar may trigger some work that we need to do as provincial regulators of gambling. As I've said, the webinar is taking place at a time that our motherland is experiencing a second ongoing pandemic on gender, domestic violence, and family-based violence, as a scourge that seems to be so unprecedented. The leadership of the foundation has thus requested us to share some insight to the extent that the legislation protects families from problem and excessive gambling. I think that's the real context of it is to whether the regulated gambling space that we all occupy, that we're all responsible for, whether it does address the unintended consequences of excessive and irresponsible gambling. Perhaps that may be linked to family, domestic, and gender-based violence. So for me, that was the essence of the topic. As to whether whilst we regulate the industry and whether there are these unintended consequences that may lead to family violence, that may lead to domestic violence, that may lead to gender-based violence, as we have seen now. So I'll try to speak on those matters. Within the context of the South African legislation, unfortunately, the South African gambling legislation and various pieces of regulations do not address this matter, as it has not been a focus. I make this point that since the unbanning of gambling, since the regulation of gambling in our country, the focus has been purely on protection of players and the integrity and fairness of the industry. Through some strict controls that we've put in place, including some supervision, the focus has been on the uniformity and harmonization of policy and legislation at all levels of government across all provinces by establishing some minimum norms, some standards, some levels of cooperation and coordination amongst ourselves. Also, the focus, Chair, has been on the generation of revenue and taxes for provincial government for good causes. We always say that we collect gambling tax and we disperse this gambling tax to the fiscus. And that gambling tax is then appropriated to all different portfolios or all different responsibilities in the province. One of the other issues that the gambling regulators, through the piece of legislation, has been ensuring that there's some economic empowerment of PDIs or historical disadvantaged persons. But most importantly has been the promotion of economic growth, development, and employment. So as you can see, although the original objective of the legislation is to ensure the protection of the public against potential harmful effects of gambling, there has been no focus on the unintended consequences of all these aspects. The legislation does It does indicate that we need to protect public against potential harmful effects of gambling. We must protect licenses against competition, illegal competition. We must ensure that we collect this money for the state through licensing fees. So the point at hand is that whilst there's importance of the Act, I found it or have not found areas where the legislation or regulations does address this unintended consequence, which is a cause of harmful effects of excessive and irresponsible gambling. The point that I'm making and the conclusion that I'm making is that the Act, both the national and the provincial, including a number of regulations, is very silent on these aspects. And we hope that the outcomes of this webinar may trigger a process for us to engage on the evidence base need to amend the National Gambling Act, as well as the various Provincial Gambling Act, perhaps also to address the unintended consequences of irresponsible gambling. Unintended consequences of responsible gambling, that these issues are then find expression in pieces of legislation, in regulations, because currently we may have the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation trying to address some of these issues, but these issues are not regulated. They don't find an expression in a piece of legislation so that they are really monitored and that there's an adherence to them. And also perhaps to mitigate harmful effects that may lead to family, domestic and gender-based violence, because all regulators in the country are not an island on their own. Issues of family violence, issues of domestic violence happen within the space where we all operate, but currently we seem to be very complicit.